You feeling stuck lately? Like life's passing you? You feeling stuck lately? Like life's passing you by? Get to know M.A.Y.A.
Acronym My Ambition, Your Ambition.
Reconnect with your dreams, your goals, your ambitions. Find your motivation and start to live the life you desire. Explore the M.A.Y.A. My Ambition, Your Ambition podcast at M.A.Y.A.com.
Namaste, everyone. Welcome to M.A.Y.A., My Ambition, Your Ambition, the podcast that I like to say looks at embracing salient topics, specifically about mental wellness. As I like to say, I am your mental wellness advocate, so to speak. Not that we're ever in session, but it's just about having some candid conversations about mental wellness and how it's really something that's an overarching influence throughout our lives. So I like to kind of bring some salient topics to the table that we can discuss that might be the things that are keeping you from getting to that best version of yourself, getting into that happy place and staying there. And remember, everything about M.A.Y.A. is that we're working from a daily perspective, not the overarching idea of, the best version of yourself or happiness. I want people to start to drill down deep and finding that best version of themselves daily, being able to achieve happiness in some form daily, because it's about quantifying it. The more you can do it and the frequency of it, it becomes a surplus. And then it does become an overarching idea. So we like to pull back that veil of self-doubt and sabotage that often troubles many of our lives. It hurts our motivation. We can't find our focus, and it keeps us away from that satisfaction and that success that we truly seek in our daily lives. So that's what M.A.Y.A. is all about. This is episode 37. Happy National Stress Awareness Month. Boy, this kind of ties in with episode 35 and 36. So April is National Stress Awareness Month, and I figured let's have a deeper conversation about stress, because a lot of times it's something that people really don't take into consideration for how much it's really influencing the outcome and impacting how they can be that best version of themselves or achieving happiness on a daily basis. So that's what episode 37 is about. It's about stress. Let's do our housekeeping things first. Of course, you can find episodes of M.A.Y.A. at M.A.Y.A.com. Remember, with every episode, I always give some additional podcast companion resources. You can always go to M.A.Y.A.com and, of course, listen to the episode. But if you go to the podcast resource section and click on episode 37, here will be a couple more supplemental things for you to read through to kind of expand the conversation beyond some of the things that I talked about in the podcast. Hopefully by now you have subscribed to my YouTube channel. So here comes a call to action. Subscribe to my website, M.A.Y.A.com. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, M.A.Y.A.Kai. And if you happen to have a podcast platform of choice, okay, I won't hold that against you, because you may like iTunes, Apple, Google Play, iHeartRadio, Amazon's Audible, Spotify. I'm in all those places. You just have to search M.A.Y.A., My Ambition, Your Ambition, and boop, subscribe to like my podcast and to follow it. Hopefully by now, everyone has gotten social with me, which means you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Maya_Akai and on Facebook at Maya Akai Presents. That's all the ways that you can tie into the show. So get social with me. I appreciate that. Our musical muse, Miriam, has been off for a couple of weeks. She's on a hiatus doing some different things, so she'll be joining us in a couple of weeks. Everybody needs a break to kind of retool and refocus, Miriam and I included. So she's off for a couple of weeks, but she'll be back. But I still want to encourage you to follow Miriam on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Listen to her music. You can find her on Spotify, Amazon Musical, iTunes, all those places. You can find some of the original pieces that she's written and had on the show as well. So though she's not here with us present, she is here with us in spirit. So make sure you follow Miriam McQueen, the M.A.Y.A. musical muse, as well. Well, before we jump into the podcast, we want to stay consistent in what we do here. If you are a first-time listener and viewer, welcome aboard. As I say, buckle up for safety. Not because it's not a safe space here, but occasionally it can be, you may have an unexpected bump here and there. I may say something that really might elicit an emotion from you or bring back a memory, something that you haven't processed. Be sure that you jot that down. Hence, if you're a returning listener reviewer, I always tell you, make sure you have a piece of paper, a pad, pencil, pens. You can jot down anything that might pop into your mind as you're listening to the episode. So that's rule of thumb for everyone. Be prepared. Of course, have your beverage of choice. For me, I'm trying to do a detox this week. So this is actually a lemon ginger water that I prepared. So that's what I'm having. And it's actually very refreshing. But whatever you choose, coffee, tea, it's 5 o'clock someplace. So feel to have whatever beverage you like, a beer, whatever, a glass of wine, so you can enjoy this. If you happen to be listening to this episode with me, currently 37, I appreciate that you are front and present with me. But more importantly, one rule of thumb with M.A.Y.A. is that work at your own pace. So if you're still back on episode 30, because that's the episode that you found there was some work that you had to do there, that's what Maya is all about. These episodes aren't going anywhere. I make them. You can find them at myakai.com or at your favorite podcast platform. Either way, so working at your pace. But if you were front and center and present with me today, I appreciate that all the same. All right, so that is our housekeeping things that we do. Let's go ahead and jump into episode 37. As I said, this is National Stress Awareness Month in April. This started back in about, I think, 1992. It moved around a bit, but this is usually the month where they really focus on stress. And given where we are in regards to the pandemic going into year 2 of it, a lot of people are experiencing depression, anxiety, but stress. And a lot of people don't put stress into focus. And this is why I think it's so important to make sure you understand when we talk about this, let's not talk about it in an abstract way. When you leave this episode, I want to make sure that you truly understand what stress is, because these are going to be the objectives of the podcast, what stress is, how it impacts you, but more importantly, how do you respond to stress, or are you still reacting? Remember, we're trying to get reacting out of our toolbox and put in respond, because that's a healthier response. So what does that mean if I just said that? It's going to be our first toolbox time of the show. I don't even feel like it's a toolbox, because it's by now, it's the most important tool that you have in your toolbox. And this is about what? Taking out your emotional intelligence, your EI, that ability to perceive, control, and evaluate emotions, not just your emotions, but that of others in the context of how it's affecting you or a situation that you're in. So stress is one of those situations where having high EI can be the difference on how you respond. So we're going to jump into that a bit throughout the episode. Like I said, we've got 3 objectives. 1, to discuss what stress is. 2, to understand how you may be impacted by stress. But 3, how do you respond? And then we can wrap it up with, hey, if this is how you're responding or reacting, here's some things to keep in mind to have a different approach to reduce the amount of stress that's in your life. So those are our objectives of Podcast Revisited. So let's get into what is stress. If we gave it, if you were to Google it, if you were to go to M.A.Y.A. and looked up the definition of stress, it's pretty much in a nutshell going to be described as a mismatch between the demands placed on you and your ability to cope with these demands. So that's usually the general descriptions. Something that's uncomfortable, unpleasant, inconvenient, and really creates a high level of, we would just say, stress. But in some cases, the word anxiety may pop in and very well could be synonymous in many situations with talking about stress. So either way, it's a high demand placed on you, and your ability to deal or cope with it sometimes is overexerted, making the stress have a stronger presence and influence on either that situation or maybe overarching in your life. Some people have very stressful lives from A to Z. Other of us may have moments where we experience stressful situations. These are all things that we'll look to talk about and to assess as we kind of talk through the show. So we talked about what stress is. Let's talk about the types of stress that there are. Now, mind you, these are very simplistic ways I'm putting this. It could be so much more elaborate, but for the sake of time and just getting to the essence of what this is, stress really manifests itself in 2 ways. There is positive stress, and someone's like, how can that be? But there are things that can be positive stress, and there are things that are negative stress. So we can divide stress into 2 different areas to determine how you're being impacted when you experience it. When stress is positive, it's something that's more of a motivator. You want to get things done. So all of a sudden you feel this pressure, maybe not necessarily anxiety, but maybe just feeling a little edgy about something. And it prompts you to move forward, to get something done, to be a bit more thorough in what you're accomplishing. Whereas negative stress is when you feel under pressure because of too many demands. You feel overwhelmed. You feel like you can't manage. And then it can turn into anxiety, and some other things can be a result of stress that we'll get into in a bit as well. So when you're thinking about stressful situations, I want you to think about when this stressful situation happened that you might be reflecting on, was it a positive type of stress or was it a negative type of stress? It's important to start with that differentiation point when we talk about stress, because some stresses in our lives actually do have a purpose. So that's one thing I want you to keep on the back burner as we move through this conversation. The next question, once we determine that there's positive and negative stress, I would pose this question. How do you know you're stressed? because you have some people who really can't discern that they are under a lot of stress, because we'll talk about this a little bit later in the podcast of how they've integrated stress into their life and to a degree have normalized it. But we're going to expand that conversation a little bit further deeper into the podcast. But I think it's important how to know you are stressed, especially if you feel like things are coming at you from different directions at different speeds. And you may be a person that may have a job that's demanding, that creates stress. You may have situations in your family where you're kind of that go-to person or the decision maker in some situations, and this creates a certain amount of stress for you. So it's key to say, depending upon what your role is, you may be experiencing different stresses at different times. One of the ways that I would tell you to determine how you're under stressed. Stressful situations, here's what's key: activate a stress hormone. They rush into your bloodstreams. I'm giving you something that's going to tell you this moment right now is stressful to me. These hormones specifically increase things like your heart rate, blood pressure goes up, and even glucose levels in some cases. So in some ways, stress can look and feel like anxiety. But what is anxiety but something that is creating a physiological response of a situation that makes a person feel uncomfortable, fearful, stressed? So stress and anxiety, though they can be very synonymous, there's some subtle differences between the two. But if you find that you've had this tension, a tightness about you, and all of a sudden, you feel like your heart is racing, your blood pressure is high. Some people have long-term blood pressure because of stress, FYI. And the glucose piece, you may not know, but that can turn into like lightheadedness or if it's too high. So, like I said, it may look and feel like anxiety. So now that we've talked about this, because these physiological responses can still be equated with positive and negative stress. So when stress is positive, it can be helpful really in emergency situations and can be an energy boost. So that adrenaline rush, so to speak, that you may feel when something kind of makes you a little uncomfortable can be the reason that you're able to. You ever hear those stories where a person's in a situation where a person is like trapped under a car and this person manages to lift this extremely heavy object that under most circumstances they would never be able to do? A stress response, so to speak. They were able, it was how their body physiologically, they had this surge in a hormone that obviously gave them strength that they never knew they could have. Not to mention, we think there's also some cognitive pieces to when exceptional things like that happen. But when stress is positive, it can help in emergency situations. All of a sudden your alarm, your spidey senses, so to speak, go off, and you feel this need to get away, to have to find a different space, to do something differently. It creates an energy boost. Sometimes under stress, which can look like anxiety. Let's just say you have to do a presentation at work, or you have to, speak in front of a crowd of people, and all of a sudden, you notice your heart rate increases and your blood pressure flows because you're getting this heightened sense of awareness. That's a stressor because you're stressed about the situation that you have to be involved in or how it might unfold, and your body is giving you this response, this boost. So see how that can be positive energy. Now, on the flip side, when is it negative stress? When you get that rush that we talked about for an extended period of time, it can be dangerous and make you susceptible to many mental and physical ailments. So you can't be under that kind of duress for long periods of time. This is where stress becomes a detriment to you emotionally, mentally, and physically. Is when it's a constant situation where you feel overwhelmed, overworked. And there isn't this sense of it being an energy boost as much as it feels restrictive. See, that's how you can truly distinguish between the positive and the negative stress, is going to be the fact that when it's positive, it doesn't feel restrictive. It feels like a surge. Whereas when it's negative, it feels very restrictive. And that sense of what you may feel as anxiety has an entirely different feel about it. Sometimes it can be very dreadful. Positive can feel that way too if you're nervous. So just know it's when you get long periods of stress and you're not able to get past that fear, that anxiety, it starts to root itself very deeply, mentally, emotionally, and physically. And we do know that stress, as well as depression, can result in many physical ailments. Often within the mental health field, when we're trying to process, and this is interesting. Have you ever gone to the doctor because you have a headache that you just couldn't seem to get rid of? And no matter what you took, it was a reoccurring headache, and to come to realize that it was probably stress related? Often, many times, and I think people get offended, but then I want to open your mind to something. If you're relatively a healthy person, and you're having like reoccurring things like headaches, maybe these palpitations, things like that, and you, one, should have it checked out, because I will tell you this, reoccurring headaches is a sign that there might be something else going on. So never take a headache for granted and be like, oh, I'll just take some Advil or something and it goes away. If it keeps reoccurring, it's your body's subtle way of telling you, hey, something's not quite right. Your body is a fine-tuned machine. So you go to the doctor and you talk about what's going on. They do their test and it comes back inconclusive for them. And they say, I just can't seem to find anything that's prompting these headaches that you're having. Then they may throw out at you, and this is where people get a little upset. Maybe you should talk to someone like a therapist. And people are like, I'm not crazy. Within mental health, we refer to when there's a manifestation of depression, anxiety, and stress that gets to a point where it's physically responsive. We kind of call it somatic complaints, because now it's manifested itself physically because it isn't being dealt with, and it can't be dealt with an Advil. This is something that comes up frequently and people get really offended. Don't be offended. What your physician is trying to do is cover all the bases to say, if I legitimately cannot find a reason why you're having reoccurring headaches or palpitations, and we've done the process of elimination and all the testing that should tell us that if there was something wrong or if there's an indicator, well, we can't rule out that this could be something mentally prompting you to feel this way. And it doesn't mean you're crazy, because your body has a way of trying to say, hey, excuse me, I'm not okay. And it's got nothing to do with me physically. It's some external stuff that's creating anxiety, stress for me that I can't handle. I'm feeling overwhelmed. Because there is a strong understanding of the correlation between stress, anxiety, depression, and what can be somatic complaints, you probably now go into your local physician, maybe for a checkup or if something's wrong, and they have you fill out something that's called a PH16 is I think the form number. And it asks you a lot of questions. And someone said, I'm kind of not liking that you're asking me about if I had thoughts of hurting myself or if I'm depressed. Well, because what physicians are trying to do is get ahead. And this is well before COVID, by the way, trying to get ahead of a lot of people are suffering from anxiety and depression, and they don't even know what it looks like because they've normalized it to a degree. So they ask you about the symptoms. If you had these kind of thoughts, they ask you about frequency, because they're trying to see if there's something here that needs to be addressed that potentially could be resulting to the health issue, but also might just need to be addressed, period. So I want people to start to open their mind, especially if your primary physician asks you questions that make you feel uncomfortable. It's part of making sure that you are holistically taken care of, emotionally, mentally, and physically. And we need to kind of rethink when people ask you questions about, have you ever thought about hurting yourself? Don't be offended, because you know what's interesting is, how many times have you heard someone say, like, I'd rather be dead than deal with this? Now, does that mean they'd rather be dead? No. But they feel like an end to all of this is easier than the stress that it's putting me under. That's a key thing. Listen to the language and listen to where your thoughts move you. If you find yourself saying frequently or too often, I'd rather be dead than deal with this, you know what, this is just too much, I'd rather go to sleep and just not wake up. It doesn't mean that's how you feel, but what this is an indicator that you are under stress. And you're saying it mentally and maybe verbally out. You're actually acknowledging it, but you're not acknowledging it at the same time. Subtle indicators that people don't think about. That's what I hope to share with you here in M.A.Y.A. That, you know what, you often have so many of the answers and solutions to what needs to be done, but you're not listening to yourself closely enough to know how to respond opposed to react. Let's get into a real talk time. I think there's maybe 2 in the show, if I remember correctly. What makes stress positive and negative? And we talked about it's the way that you cope with demands, often depending on the way you think about them, your personality and life experience in dealing with them, aka learned behavior. The reason this is a real talk time is because in many cultures, the idea of anxiety, depression, and stress are absolutely pushed to the back burner like they don't exist. You have many cultures. So if you happen to be from my co-cultures of being Latino and Black, let's be honest. We don't like to, air our dirty laundry. Most people do not like to admit when there's something wrong, and it becomes a mounting issue. And by the way, if you've been paying close attention, you can see where these mounting issues end up. So part of the issue that some people don't even acknowledge or deal with stress is because culturally they've been conditioned, hence a learned behavior, to not do it. So one of the first things you might be doing is breaking a cultural cycle that is not about healthy thinking in regards to your mental health. We have some cultures that don't even do good with their physical health, not going to the doctors for proper checkups and things of that nature, kind of pushing it to the back burner. That mindset about your mental health and your physical health has to change. We won't even get into your financial health. That's a whole nother episode. But there's a lot of culture misnomers that really put people in situations that their eyes are not wide open about situations they need to address with themselves. So real talk, think about this and how you grew up in your household. Was there really, when issues were difficult, did you notice how they were addressed? Were they directly addressed or put on the back burner? Or was it kind of put on as, it's my burden to carry this? It's not your burden to carry anything necessarily. You have to pick and choose when you decide to do the heavy lifting by yourself. Nobody was born to be Atlas, the god who holds the world, so to speak, for all my mythology people. No one was born to be Atlas. So stop acting like it. One of the biggest things that we have to learn to put in our toolbox is that vulnerability and acknowledging where you are not strong, where you may be weak, is so important to how you proceed through your life and put boundaries up and relationships. And this kind of goes into the next piece of this, a kind of a new piece I'm integrating into the podcast thread. At episode 35, we talked about boundaries, understanding where you may start, but where you end with things emotionally, mentally, and physically, especially with other people. But first, you must set boundaries for yourself, which means you understand this emotionally makes me uncomfortable. This is within a physical space that does not work for me. So when someone places me here, I get that danger, Will Robinson, danger. I've gotten too close to my boundary and I need to step back. Or I need to let someone know, unfortunately, this makes me uncomfortable, so I'm going to step back from this. And the key thing about boundaries is other people don't have to understand nor accept your boundaries. They are for you specifically. All you have to make sure is you stand your ground on them. And when someone doesn't want to respect you, you remove yourself from that situation that's compromising your boundary. People get too comfortable with compromising their boundaries for other people. So that was episode 35. So how we tie stress into this is that if you keep overextending your boundaries, that becomes stressful because you feel like you're doing too much. You're present in too many places. You don't have a peace of mind. You feel fatigued because you're extending your boundaries too much. And the question always should come to, for what? Why are you extending your boundaries? What is the benefit? What is the reward with the risk of stepping past your boundary? Episode 36 discussed emotional and mental messes. And this gets into loving to carry your baggage around, opposed to sitting down and unpacking the things that you need to let go of. Reconciling things that emotionally and mentally make you feel conflicted. 2 great episodes. So what happens when you keep carrying baggage around? It's stressful because it's heavy. And eventually, your baggage can get so heavy that you're fatigued, worn out, and then it starts to look like depression and high anxiety because you're carrying around too much stress. So this is how episode 37 kind of just keeps putting the thread together and kind of linking the concepts. And mind you, I didn't plan to do it this way, but April is stress management, month and awareness. So I figured, why not share it with you? So think about that. Understanding your boundaries and really reconciling your emotional and mental messes, how those 2 things right there can reduce stress for you. And if you don't know what those things are, then your first thing is, okay, I acknowledge I got some boundary issues. Oh, I acknowledge I do have some emotional and mental messes, along with some financial, spiritual, and physical messes, one thing at a time. Write down the things you're struggling with, because then you start saying, why do I struggle? And then you get to the core of the stress, where it comes from. And then you can put an action plan together. Okay, let's move into a toolbox time. Technically, I say this is one because the one about emotional intelligence is kind of like an episode staple. We're always taking out our EI. It's always on the table with this. I hope you're using your EI even when you're not listening to My Ambition, Your Ambition. Because the thing is, it's the best tool and most important tool you have in your toolbox. It was interesting. I was speaking with a client the other day, and she mentioned in therapy, there was this epiphany because the therapist talked about a toolbox. And I said, what? I'm like, toolboxes are a staple. You got to have a toolbox. And sometimes you got to clean out your toolbox because it can get a little messy. Sometimes you need new tools and take out old tools that no longer are truly functional for the project that you're working on. You should be using tools based on the project that you're working on. Emotional intelligence is always going to be the tool you're never, ever, 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 ever going to throw away, just to let you know. All right. So toolbox time, technically one in the show. We're working at being objective all the time. Look, listen, and evaluate. This kind of pulls together at the end of the podcast. We talk about subjectivity and objectivity, and we've talked about it enough for me to say to you, I really need for you to take subjectivity out of your toolbox, because that is the one tool that's not a tool that actually makes you get into your feelings, because it means you're only seeing things from your perspective. Objectivity means you're removing the emotional response, that your reaction that you're having, whatever the situation is starting to kind of pull upon you with and making you feel a certain way. Objectivity says, tap, 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 tap. Guess what? Right now, this is really having an emotional impact on you. Because notice you feel a little warm. Your heart's racing. Ooh, stressors. Why am I feeling this way? Why is this person eliciting this response from me, this reaction? Why is the situation eliciting this reaction from me? And sometimes you may think you resolved something to only find that you hadn't. So I want us to remove subjectivity from the toolbox today. Just leave it on. Just don't do with it what you please. I just want it out your toolbox because I want you to stop using the subjectivity to make decisions and start using objectivity. And how we make objective decisions is that we have to learn to look, to listen, and evaluate. That's the tool that we really want to start to work with, especially when we start doing that reconciliation things with emotionally, why do I have messes? What is this boundary? You have to be able to look and say, this is where I'm seeing the problem. I'm hearing how people are responding to my problem. Let me evaluate why this is going on. So we really want to start to make objectivity along with emotional intelligence two of the most important toolboxes you have in your toolbox. They are so functioning and it's important. Let's jump a bit into talking about what areas in your life is stress affecting you. Mind you, this could be all of these domains. One may have a greater prevalence of stress present than another. Or you may say, generally speaking, I think I'm low stress on all these, but it doesn't mean I can't do a little bit more cleanup with these things. So here's one that's kind of the overarching conversation: daily living. Daily living within itself can honestly be stressful. Daily living is that burden that you constantly, when it's high stress, it means that you constantly feel challenged. There's difficulty in obtaining resolutions to things, and everything turns into mounting stress. So it seems like in everything that you do, and often you'll hear someone say something like, I just can't do anything right. That's stress. Stress that now has turned into them having no self-esteem because they don't feel they can do anything right. Remember, the dialogue you have with yourself will tell you a lot about where you're at in regards to managing your stress. Like I said, I'm going to say it again. That internal dialogue you have with yourself will tell you where you're at in dealing with stress. So like I said, if you too often say things like, I'd rather be dead than deal with this. We all have said that. But if that's the answer to every time you feel challenged, you're not responding to stress in a way that's healthy for you. If you're thinking, I'd rather not wake up than deal with this, your stress has gotten to be too much, and you really need to deal with it head on. Now, mind you, dealing with stress head on often means you have to be courageous and be willing to take that risk, because it's about making something better for you. And it might make somebody else uncomfortable. That's one thing that people struggle with, especially with boundaries. I'm willing to be super, super uncomfortable because I don't want to make other people uncomfortable. Why? Because one, well, they may not like me, or two, they may leave me. Well, if they leave you, maybe that's for the best. Because if you can't express yourself, if you keep putting more things into your baggage, more stress situations, how is this ever happy or healthy? And why would you want to be a place where you're fully restricted from having any form of autonomy or being able to express yourself emotionally or mentally? But people often are willing to pay that price. And when they realize they've paid too much, It's never too late, but they realize all the time they wasted negating themselves, negating their happiness, negating being the best version of themselves. So, if daily living is constantly heavy lifting for you, I want you to think about why. And then I really want you to start writing down things. I want you to start writing down. This is difficult for me. This is difficult for me. This is difficult for me. And then you can move into the why it's difficult. And that column, you might need lots of space. So you literally may take one sheet of paper and write, one, this is difficult for me. Why? And start writing why. And sometimes it's easier to bullet point your ideas than trying to write, like these paragraphs out, because this is not an essay class. This is just a tool to help you to be able to visually put your stress and make it tangible, because there's different types of therapy out there. I love narrative therapy because narrative therapy is where you build your story. You give things characters and their storylines. And it's interesting because when people are asked to tell their story, it's interesting how they can process how their life has unfolded and the ups and the downs and where mistakes have happened and where they've had success, because they've never thought that I'm a story. Everyone's a story. Huge fan of narrative therapy, and it often works great with children. But adults find so much value in it as well. So if you're not quite sure where you're being stressed, I want you to start to write these things down because they're important. And if every day seems stressful for you, then we've definitely got some work to do. And that's why I say, I think you need to move past your friendly neighborhood therapist, M.A.Y.A, or if you're a wellness advocate, and maybe it's time that you talk to somebody. Because if every day is difficult, we have to really do the work of pulling apart, why is every day difficult? Okay, 2, maintaining a healthy lifestyle can be so complicated for people. Often health issues like poor diet lead to stress. Poor diet, results in then weight gain, fatigue, and other issues and concerns overall with someone's health and trying to manage it. I can't tell you how many people I know on a daily basis are actively trying to be healthier people. And it's a challenge. Some people can do it without any issue or problem. And there are other people who truly struggle, especially like with weight loss. Maybe some people have overarching health issues. Another way to kind of know your stress is knowing your family history. Is there a family history of being weight issues? Is there a family history of hypertension? Is there a family issue with, any kind of cardiac issues? Here's one, God forbid I say it. Is there issues with mental health issues in your family? Is there a history of depression, anxiety, bipolar disorder? Some people just don't want to acknowledge things. But if you're fighting information because you don't want to acknowledge it, that means you're not putting yourself in a position to truly help yourself. So people often struggle with maintaining healthy lifestyles because daily demands sometimes make it complicated just to make time for yourself. So if you're trying to eat healthy, work out, do this, do that, meditate, whatever, sometimes it feels very challenging because of all the daily demands that are outside our household. And then we get to our household and there's additional demands there. Has that caused too much stress for you? Another thing that definitely should be in here is the sleep component. Sleep is so important because it's our body's time to reset, to reboot. And if you're not getting enough sleep, or if you're not getting good sleep, you need to address that. Okay. A third area where there can definitely be stress is trying to strike that work-life balance. A lot of people really struggle with the work-life balance piece because you got to go to work and you got to do your job. There is no, I can slack on this because then you could lose your job. So a lot of people struggle with the work-life balance, and then they get home and their energy is just absolutely zapped because they spent 8, 10, 12 hours a day being mentally taxed, because your job may mentally tax you or it may physically tax you. And they get home and they just don't have a whole lot left. So trying to strike that balance. On the flip side, things can be totally chaotic at home, like just a hot heaping mess. And then you take it to work with you. See? Striking that work-life balance is hard. See, this is why stress can be mounting, because look how much accountability and focus you have to have on just thinking about this and ways to manage it. But if you ignore it, it doesn't go away. All it does is get bigger, better, and makes life harder for you. That's just how it is. So that's why I'm like, no matter how you feel about anything I'm saying, just know failure to address it just means it's going to be more complicated the more you let it snowball. Snowballs start real small, like you can pick it up. But eventually when it starts rolling downhill, and what do they tell you? What rolls downhill? Stress. it gets big. And when it gets big, it can roll you over. It can destroy things. Then it turns into an avalanche, for God's sakes. So this is why it's worth doing the work, dealing with it, so you can find that balance in your life. Stress is always going to exist. So I don't want you to think in this perfect world of utopia that there is no stress. Yes, stress is normal. We just have to learn where you have stress, how you deal with it, and if how you're dealing with it is appropriate to reduce the outcome or effects of it. It's always going to be there. It's how we choose to respond to reduce the outcome. That's the key thing. A fourth area, and it's probably one of the most stressful areas for most people across the board, is relationships. Everyone struggles with striking a balance in their relationships, especially when they have high value. When we feel we fall short in relationships, our relationships are suffering because maybe we're doing too much at work or we're too exhausted to put time into it. That stress can be very overwhelming and consuming because especially when there's an emotional connection to something, stress can seem almost unbearable. Because you may feel like this is so difficult for me, or you might be dealing with a person who's stressful. I say this, I think I've said this 4 episodes now. And someone's like, oh my God, Maya, that's heartless, but gosh, it makes sense. We love to throw amazing sayings out to empower people. Some of these sayings are not empowering to me. And when you say something like, meet me where I'm at, my first question is, where are you? Why are you there? And if I have to meet you where you are, am I going backwards to do it? And the minute I decide to take any step backwards, I need to say, is this truly the right thing for me to go backwards to meet you? That's a hard conversation to have, because why that person might be where they're at may have nothing to do with you, and it may be their poor choices in life, or it could be circumstances. So you got to decide, when you decide to go back, is that going to bring you under when you're trying to accommodate somebody else? Ooh, it's that conversation about selfishness and selflessness and understanding where it exists. Now, I may not fully take all those steps back to meet you, but it doesn't mean I won't turn around and look at you and put my hand out and say, you know something? Let me lift you up. Let's bring you forward. How can we do that? There goes a different approach. I don't leave you emotionally or mentally stranded. I might leave you financially stranded, though, for real. Maybe. I laugh, but I can't even say that's not true. Because if you're messy financially, I'm not trying to jump in that with you, for real. But in those other domains, like spirituality and physically, if a person is like, hey, I want to lose weight, I'm struggling with this. Look, hey, let me do this with you. This is good. Let me motivate you. So put out your hand to pull someone forward, opposed to thinking you got to turn around and walk backwards. It's a different idea of the thought of actually helping somebody. So those are the areas, and I kind of scaled them back because these things are kind of overarching and covers a lot of different places. You can probably plug anything into these areas. Maybe only one of these areas is where you feel more stressed. Maybe you feel like you kind of low stress on all things. And if you're low stress, that's even better. It means you must have some good coping skills. You're responding to things more appropriately. And that's good to hear. And I'm sure it's been a learning curve overall. Vernon Fairley, thank you for tuning in. Remember, you can always join the show in conversation, just like Vernon here, by typing in your comment on Facebook or YouTube, and boom, I can click and share it on the screen with the other viewers. And if you're listening, I'll read, as he said, inspirational message by Maya. I try, I do. So thank you for tuning in. But that's the key thing. So those are areas where stress can be present and not easy. And take the time and write down where you really feel like you're struggling. Because when you put it on paper, it's kind of like you're calling it into reality. It goes from being an abstract stress to being a concrete thing. You could say, this situation right here, I just wrote it down. And I wrote down why it's stressful for me. And I wrote down ways that I can attempt to deal with it. And it might be incremental changes. Everything about dealing with stress doesn't mean some sweeping change. That's not what I'm saying. People always do too much all the time. Stop being team too much. Just because you're fixing something, it might be something you do in small steps incrementally to have the outcome you want, opposed to trying to do some big sweeping change. And then it could be even more overwhelming and stressful because you're doing too much. Can you chip away at it and still get the same outcome without feeling so overwhelmed about what you're trying to achieve? Having small successes and saying, I did that. And at first I was really nervous about it, but I feel like a load was lifted off my chest. Getting that feeling, that sense of release is huge. It's huge. So those are kind of tips and techniques. We'll get that down the road. But I want to talk about what happens with stress, especially when it goes beyond being cognitive or in the mind. And that's you got to think about your situation and your issues, and how often they can be so stressful, they can manifest themselves in physical ways. This is why I said primary care physicians will start to ask people questions about their life to figure out if this headache or, your high blood pressure, is this stress related? It's kind of like there's a stress test they do for your heart, which is more about how much you get on a treadmill and you run. It's like, how much exertion can your heart take before it's stressful? It's kind of the same thing, but there is no stress test for the mind, except for you being accountable to yourself to know you're not in a good place. We already know that research has discovered that people, like I said, experience headaches, stomach disorders, they feel like they have upset stomachs. There's gastrointestinal issues. We know that obviously depression and anxiety, because anxiety looks and feels a lot like stress because it's really often physiologically, but it can go as far to have stroke and heart disease can result from having too much intense stress. So research has been there to show hey, stress is real. It isn't a figment of your imagination. And don't let somebody make you feel like it is. Before we move on, I want to share this video with you because I want to show you how real stress really is, and people don't get it. Long-term stress, which I will tell you is trauma to a very high degree, actually changes the brain structure. So imagine a child being under constant, I would say, duress, because it's gone past just being stress. And my point for me, when you're under constant stress, now it's duress at that point. But how it can change the brain structure and what that means for a person that has allowed themselves, or unfortunately, maybe they didn't allow themselves to be under such conflicting situations that they feel there's no resolution. Take a listen to this. It's very enlightening.
Are you sleeping restlessly, feeling irritable or moody, forgetting little things, and feeling overwhelmed and isolated? Don't worry, we've all been there. You're probably just stressed out. Stress isn't always a bad thing. It can be handy for a burst of extra energy and focus, like when you're playing a competitive sport or have to speak in public. But when it's continuous, the kind most of us face day in and day out, it actually begins to change your brain. Chronic stress, like being overworked or having arguments at home, can affect brain size, its structure, and how it functions, right down to the level of your genes. Stress begins with something called the hypothalamus-pituitary-adrenal axis, a series of interactions between endocrine glands in the brain and on the kidney, which controls your body's reaction to stress. When your brain detects a stressful situation, your HPA axis is instantly activated and releases a hormone called cortisol, which primes your body for instant action. But high levels of cortisol over long periods of time wreak havoc on your brain. For example, chronic stress increases the activity level and number of neural connections in the amygdala, your brain's fear center. And as levels of cortisol rise, electric signals in your hippocampus, the part of the brain associated with learning, memories, and stress control, deteriorate. The hippocampus also inhibits the activity of the HPA axis, so when it weakens, so does your ability to control your stress. That's not all, though. Cortisol can literally cause your brain to shrink in size. Too much of it results in the loss of synaptic connections between neurons and the shrinking of your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that regulates behaviors like concentration, decision-making, judgment, and social interaction. It also leads to fewer new brain cells being made in the hippocampus. This means chronic stress might make it harder for you to learn and remember things, and also set the stage for more serious mental problems like depression and eventually Alzheimer's disease. The effects of stress may filter right down to your brain's DNA. An experiment showed that the amount of nurturing a mother rat provides its newborn baby plays a part in determining how that baby responds to stress later in life. The pups of nurturing moms turned out less sensitive to stress because their brains developed more cortisol receptors, which stick to cortisol and dampen the stress response. The pups of negligent moms had the opposite outcome, and so became more sensitive to stress throughout life. These are considered epigenetic changes, meaning that they affect which genes are expressed without directly changing the genetic code. And these changes can be reversed if the moms are swapped. But there's a surprising result. The epigenetic changes caused by one single mother rat were passed down to many generations of rats after her. In other words, the results of these actions were inheritable. It's not all bad news, though. There are many ways to reverse what cortisol does to your stressed brain. The most powerful weapons are exercise and meditation, which involves breathing deeply and being aware and focused on your surroundings. Both of these activities decrease your stress and increase the size of the hippocampus, thereby improving your memory. So don't feel defeated by the pressures of daily life. Get in control of your stress before it takes control of you.
Very informative video, maybe a little top heavy, but I think you got the gist of what they were saying. If you understand how stress, I didn't even get into epigenetics, that's a whole nother conversation. One thing about cortisol we've come to learn is cortisol in heavy levels is also tied to weight gain. So often if a person's under heavy stress, and this has been going on for a while, this can result in weight gain as well. So cortisol is a very interesting hormone produced in the brain, and the balance of it is really, really important. So I wanted to share that video because, especially when I said they talked about the study with rats, I wanted people to understand that stress long-term has such adverse effects. Many people sometimes don't even realize how much they've been under duress in their lives and why the stress level was where it is and that sensitivity to it. So I wanted to share it because I thought it was very, very helpful and gave some great insight. Like I said, it might have been a little technical, but I don't think it was anything that people, at least maybe haven't heard loosely about frontal cord, and memory and some other things that are also being researched too is, even with ADHD and ADD, is there this underlying situation where there's stress that ties into this hormonally, all kinds of studies. So mental health is actually this field that isn't just about therapy and, talking. We do a lot of research within the field of psychology to really put thought into the types of treatment that are going to be beneficial for people. So I felt it was important to talk to you about stress because I was talking about headaches and gastric intestinal issues and things of that nature, but it can go a lot deeper than that. And I wanted you to truly understand that. So let's have our second real talk time of the show. And I kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier when I started the show. Have you normalized stress in your life? And I ask this question because a lot of people get to the point in their lives where things can be so complicated and seem so difficult. They believe this is what it's come to be and don't believe that it can be anything else. And if you've gotten to that place, the first thing you have to do is begin to deconstruct your thought about what stressful situations look like, what they feel like, and what they sound like. Because hence, you've been reacting to pretty much everything in your life opposed to been responding. So you can't even learn to respond because you're still in a subjective state. And this is why I said one of the most important toolboxes, tools that we're going to put in there along with emotional intelligence is going to be being objective. That piece is so important for you to understand. So I want you to ask yourself that really hard question. Have you normalized stress in your life? You assume this is just how things have to be because you have never known it to be any other way. So let's talk about some tips for coping with stress. And this comes from the CDC. I like to give the CDC a little bit of love because sometimes, they get some bad blood and not always the respect that they should, especially with COVID going on. But the CDC has a lot of heavy lifting they do in a lot of areas, including mental health. And most people don't know it. And these are some basic things that I feel if you are struggling with stress, I want you to consider which one of these things that you can start to do today. It doesn't mean start all four. Remember, I said things are incremental and trying to do things better. So if you can pick one of these things to start with today, that can be the thing that makes the difference. One of the first things that the CDC recommends when you're trying to cope with stress is, take care of yourself. The word self-care is thrown around all the time, and people usually don't do it because their life is so busy. They've got so many responsibilities. Most people will give themselves a reason why they maybe can't carve out 10, 15, 20, 30 minutes of their day out of a 24-hour day. They can't grant themselves 30 minutes to reflect and kind of, desensitize everything and just be within a space by themselves. So if you can find a way to exercise regularly, sleep is key. Even if the first thing you do is that I am going to make sure I get at least a minimum of 6 to 8 hours of sleep, which means I got to be in bed at this time. That's a step in you doing something for you that's healthy. I understand exercising can be a challenge. So maybe it means just going outside and taking a walk versus going to a gym. Or maybe you put on your calendar, I'm working out twice a week and this is the time I've set aside for myself. You have to create this time to do these things. Something else the CDC recommends is that you discuss your problems. Sometimes when you get more things out opposed to in, that's the important part. So discuss your problems with a parent, friend, or another trusted source. Note, what I'm not saying is complaining does not solve the problem. So in talking about something, if all you want to do is talk about the problem, but you're not looking to find solution or resolution to it, this talking is actually only going to make the stress worse. Granted, you got to get it out, but you're not finding ways to deal with the situation that's within your control. 3, and this is big. I had this conversation with someone today. I had time to go out and meet somebody for lunch, a good friend, and we had some great conversations. And, we talked about how it's so easy for people to find refuge in drugs and alcohol to manage their stress. Now, I don't want you to feel like if you come home and have a glass of wine, that's not it. But if it's always the answer, if you think the answer, it's not even if you think the answer's in the bottle, you think the release or the forgetfulness is in the bottle. That's not going to solve it. And all you're doing is compounding something and making it more difficult. Oh, and by the way, you're probably long-term compromising your health. So now you've created another issue down the road for yourself. So if you find you're falling into that area, be mindful of it. Approach it. Think about it. And if you know anybody who falls into this, don't be afraid to speak up and say something. One of the 4 things that the CDC recommended, and I think that these are all very manageable. Recognize when you need more help. If talking to your friends, your family, a trusted source isn't getting you to where you need to be, that's when you might want to take time to go speak to a psychologist, a social worker, a counselor. If you find that the stress has gotten to a point that you really can't manage and your life just seems like it's an absolute mess, that's when you go and you talk to somebody. I always recommend to people that you might have a job where an EAP, an employee assistance program, is in place, which actually is fantastic because they counsel on just about everything. Grief, finances, stress, relationship issues, they cover the whole gamut. And they're usually only up to 5 sessions. And after they complete those 5 sessions with you, they will ultimately say, I think you should continue this with someone else, and they'll give you a referral. So it's a way to kind of quick, fast, see somebody, figure out if you can resolve this in that short time frame, or if you need something a bit more intensive. So I strongly recommend that. If you don't have an EAP, but you don't know how to find a provider, you don't know who's in network, and you have insurance, then just turn over your insurance card and call the customer service line and say, I need to find a therapist. I live here. Who's in my area? And they do the work for you. And they can tell you pretty much who's in network. Or you can get online, search for someone in your area. I always recommend this because you can go to almost everyone has a website, and you kind of read on their background, their specialty. Often we have a picture, and you can be like, this might be somebody I think I'd want to see based on their background or what their specialty is. So there's different ways for you to find a provider. It isn't often that your primary care doctor, sometimes they will have social workers in the office, but you won't know that unless you ask. Or if you filled out the questionnaire and they feel you need to talk to somebody, they may give you a referral. So there's different ways that you can get to somebody that you can talk to. So those are different ways that the CDC recommends that you deal with stress. My final thoughts on stress. There were a couple different things that I'm going to pull when I talked about learning how to be objective. I talked about look, listen, evaluate. This is how you learn to be objective. And the key thing about the first thing I want you to think about with stress, control. Recognize when you don't have it. People expend more energy trying to change things that's not within their scope or their control, and get even more agitated, angry, depressed, or stressed because the outcome hasn't changed. I need you to look at situations. I need you to look at what's happening. Listen to what you hear, your dialogue with yourself. Remember I told you I want you to start listening to that internal dialogue you're having with yourself, not just the external dialogue you're having with other people. And then evaluate this and say, this is the area that I know I can control and make that change. I can't control this because this is not within my scope. And you have to learn to accept that. People will obsess on the things that they cannot change, and this is why they never move forward and being that best version of themselves, or more importantly, achieving daily happiness. The next thing I want you to look and listen and evaluate is see anxiety. Be mindful of getting worked up when situations that you can't change or control come along. Often we feel this way at work. You'll be like, I'm just over this. I'm mad. Step back. Work, somebody pays you to come and do something. So there's only going to be so much control you have unless you're self-employed. And you got to keep in mind, I don't particularly care for this situation. And I always tell people, if you feel it's a detriment to be where you are, where you work, then you should be finding your exit strategy. That means a different job if it's that stressful for you. But sometimes people will compromise that because they love the idea of money more than their peace of mind, until their peace of mind is compromised to the point that they have to address the issue. The next thing I want you to look, listen, and evaluate is focus on responding. Control your reactions by focusing your mind on something that makes you feel calm and takes away the desire to react. So the minute you start feeling your heart race and you're starting to get warm, boom, your physiological alarm has gone off and you already know you're about to either react or respond. So have that ding, 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 ding moment and say, okay, if you're talking to someone, say, you know something, I need to step away and kind of, wrap my head around this. I'll be back to talk about this. I don't care if they don't like it or not. You have a right to give yourself space, especially if it's not a healthy environment. Unfortunately, sometimes you could be in a position where you can't. This is where you want to sit there, take some deep breaths, kind of focus on something else, so then you can take your mind away from the stress. But that takes practice to be able to control your emotions, especially if you've been in reacting mode more than you've been in responding mode. So learning how to respond in situations where there is no clear exit or escape is discipline based, and you can get there like everybody else. The fourth thing I want you to look, listen, and evaluate is developing realistic goals to help you see situations and how you can manage solutions that are real and feasible. Hence, I talked about doing things incrementally. So you look at the situation that caused stress, you identify why it caused stress, and then you say, how can I change this? Is there only one way? Is there two ways? Are there 3 or 4 options? And if there's multiple options, which one makes sense for me? Which one can I really have more control over? Which one makes me feel more comfortable? The answer may not always be easy, but give yourself progress to work on. And when you make that progress and you see a shift or maybe less stress is happening because you made a change in something, I need to do something that people will never do. Give yourself a pat on the back and say, you know something? I do feel better that I dealt with that situation, that I removed this. I was having a stressor where my role got changed around, where I went from having a 12-hour shift to an 8, and it was chaotic for me. And I didn't realize how chaotic and stressful it was until one day I was like, I can't do this anymore. This is just mentally overwhelming for me. I don't feel I'm performing at my highest level. I went back and made one small change, and that one small change, I instantly saw a shift and not feeling stressed. But first I had to acknowledge that there was that issue, what my options were, and then choosing to take the option that made sense, that could give me more of an immediate change. And I was like, I'm so happy I did that. Totally made a change in how I felt about things. All right, everybody, that is episode 37. This is National Stress Awareness Month in April. I'm glad you could join in. Like I said, Miriam's on a little bit of a hiatus. She'll be back with us in a week or two to kind of do the show. Everybody needs that little kind of decompression time, needs to be able to, get out there and do some things. And I'm all about, hey, self-care. So if you need time to do self-care, do it. But do me a favor. Make sure you follow her on Facebook and Instagram at Miriam McQueen. Visit her website, MiriamMcQueen.com, for her music. Of course, you can always find her music and stuff at iTunes, Spotify, all those different places. All you got to do, she made it easy for you, is search Miriam McQueen. All right. Let's wrap up the show with our housekeeping stuff on the back end. So if you are a first-time listener or viewer, you can now unbuckle, take a deep breath, because you have arrived at your destination, the end of the show. And if you're a returning listener, thank you for being here. Always appreciate your support. Remember, you can always find episodes of M.A.Y.A, My Ambition, Your Ambition, at M.A.Y.A.Akai.com. What did I say? Call to action. Subscribe to my YouTube channel, M.A.Y.A Akai. And if you have that podcast platform of choice, I don't hold that against you. Just make sure you like and subscribe there as well. You can find me on iTunes, Google Play, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Amazon Audibles. You can find me in all of those places. So there's no excuse that you should not be able to support me in some way. And of course, get social with me. You can always find me on Maya_Akai on Instagram and Twitter, and M.A.Y.A Akai Presents is where you find me on Facebook. Well, everyone, until next time, how do I end the show? Remember, your present becomes your past, and your future is no more. So make the most of every single day, because you know what? you don't get it back. All right, everybody. Ciao.
Get inspired, get motivated with M.A.Y.A and the M.A.Y.A, My Ambition, Your Ambition podcast.
Something that I take pride in is trying to be forward thinking, thinking outside the box, challenging myself. And as I challenge myself, hopefully I challenge you.
Find M.A.Y.A on Twitter and Instagram at M.A.Y.A_Akai. On Facebook at M.A.Y.A Akai Presents.
We're going to talk health, wealth, fitness, mental health, financial, lots of different things that can empower you as you seek out the ambition that you're pursuing.
Or get everything M.A.Y.A at M.A.Y.A Akai.com.